is that when we're reading the Bible, we're not actually reading the words of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. We're reading translations from the Greek language in which these books were written. And something is always lost in translation. Not only that, but we're not reading translations of the originals of these books, because we don't have the originals of these books or of any of the other books of the New Testament. What we have are copies made centuries later, many of them many, many centuries later. These thousands of copies that we have are all different from one another in lots of little ways and sometimes in big ways. There are places where we don't know what the authors of the New Testament originally wrote. So an author like Mark, the author of our first gospel, sat down and wrote out one day his gospel about Jesus. Now, we don't know where Mark actually lived. Some scholars have thought that Mark maybe lived in Rome, so let's say he lived in Rome. Mark writes his book. Well, how does this book get into circulation? The problem is we're dealing with an age in which there were no Xerox machines, there wasn't desktop publishing yet, no PDF files. In fact, there wasn't carbon paper. How did people get copies of books? Well, in the ancient world, the only way to get a copy of a book was to copy it by hand. One page, one sentence, one word, one letter at a time. Mark makes his book, and somebody in his community wants another copy of it. And so that person either makes a copy himself or has somebody else make a copy for him. Now, part of the problem is that in the ancient world, at this time period in the Roman Empire, probably something like 90% of the population was illiterate, couldn't read or write. So not anybody could just make a copy. And most people who could write couldn't write very well. And so somebody makes a copy. We don't know who it was who made the first copy. We don't know if this person was competent or incompetent, but he made a copy. And probably, if he made a copy of this book by hand, one page, one sentence, one word, one letter at a time, he made mistakes. Now, my students sometimes have difficulty believing that people make mistakes when they copy things by hand. And so I tell them, well, you sit down tonight and copy the Gospel of Mark and see how you do. Well, in fact, they'll make mistakes. Now, here we have a problem created, because we have the second copy of Mark that is also put in circulation, and somebody wants a copy of Mark, and so they copy the copy. But the copy has mistakes in it. And so the next person who copies it copies the mistakes, thinking that they're the original wording. And the second person also makes mistakes of his own. And so he not only reproduces the mistakes of his predecessor, he introduces his own mistakes. And then another person comes along and copies that copy, making the mistakes of both of his predecessors and creating mistakes of his own, and then that book gets put in. And pretty soon you've got copies around the city of Rome that are all different from one another. Now a visitor comes to Rome from Ephesus, and they have a church back in Ephesus too, and they want a copy of this gospel, and so he takes a copy, makes a copy, takes it back to Ephesus. Then that copy gets copied, and that copy gets copied, and that copy gets copied. Then somebody comes from Smyrna, and they want a copy. And so it goes for year after year after year. We don't have a copy of Mark until around the year 200. About 150 years after Mark was originally written. So not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies, or the copies of 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 the copies, etc., etc. Mistakes were made en route, and these mistakes were replicated. And all of the books of the New Testament, all 27 books, experienced the same fate. And so that is the situation we're dealing with. This is not a situation that's unique to the New Testament. This is a situation that we find for every book from the ancient world. Yeah, well, this strikes me as a rather significant change, that the story of the woman taken in adultery wasn't originally there.
طلعت طبعة جديدة للكتاب المقدس، في أولها ملاحظات تقول دي مزيدة ودي ناقصة في بعض النسخ. طب ما الكلام ده يشكك يا جماعة، غير النسخين يقولوا علينا ايه؟ بتزودوا في الكتاب وبتنقصوا، ودي مش موجودة في نسخ ودي موجودة في حاجة تانية. يا ريت إن القائمين على طبع الكتاب المقدس يفرقون تماما بين ما يقال في كليات اللاهوت وما يعطى للمؤمن العادي ليقرأه. المؤمن العادي يتعبه انك تقول له دي مزيدة ودي ناقصة ودي موجودة في نسخ ومش موجودة في نسخ.
These are some of the big differences that you can find in the New Testament manuscripts, and there are all sorts of differences that you find. Some are related to theological disputes of early Christianity, where scribes have changed the text to make it coincide more closely with their own theological views.
طب عايز يبعد عن المعنى خالص. ونحن لا نسمح لإنسان يحرف الكتاب المقدس. المحرف أفاق كلنا نشرت فين وجت منين. والمهم ان عمل زي معلمه برضه كاتب لك المرجع فين بالانجليزي. ذا كريستيان بايبل. كريستيان بايبل ده احنا عندنا كذا فيرجن من البايبل. أنه واحد فيهم. احنا عندنا كذا فيرجن من البايبل. أنه واحد فيهم.